Hello, and welcome to Recipes with Ben. This is the second video in my quest to learn how to make excellent homemade bread. In the previous video, I used a Polish pre-ferment to make this loaf that proofed at room temperature. But since it's winter in my house, the temperature is only about 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little cold for making bread, and you typically need a good rise in the temperature range of 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the previous loaf tasted completely fine, but there was a lot of unevenness in the crumb structure, where the inside was a little dense and the outside was kind of big and airy with uneven air pockets. So in this video, I'm trying to find a method to help improve the overall proofing of the bread to get a consistent rise each time during the winter. So all that said, let's get into it and see if we can improve the proof of the bread. And if you have any other suggestions on how to do this, feel free to drop a comment down below. Alright, to start, I'm going to make things a little bit simpler today by activating the yeast with warm water and sugar to kick off the yeast growth. That means I need to heat up the water to between 100 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit using an electric kettle and moderate it with a thermometer. Then into a large mixing bowl, I'm going to add 360 ml of warm water, followed by 1 teaspoon of honey. But if you want to, sugar would also work in this case. Then I mix the honey into the water until it's fully dissolved, and then I'm going to add in 1 teaspoon of yeast and let that sit and grow for 10 to 15 minutes, or until it looks nice and foamy and showing healthy yeast growth at the top. I placed the metal bowl into my stand mixer and added 510 grams of flour to the liquid that was inside, making this a 70% hydration dough. And based on the last loaf, I wanted to increase the salt from 10 grams to 15 grams. And then after adding all the ingredients, I'm going to add in the dough hook attachment and begin kneading for a few minutes. It'll first start by turning shaggy, and then as the water incorporates into the flour, it'll start to pull away from the sides. And then at that point, I'm going to remove it from the mixing bowl and add it to another large bowl that has a lid. Now to improve the proof of the dough, I'm going to use my electric kettle and heat up about 500 ml of water to a boil. Once it's at a boil, I'm going to pour that into a large heat-proof bowl. Then this hot water in the bowl will sit below the dough inside the oven with the oven door closed, and in theory the steam should heat up the oven just enough to make this a nice proofing box. I'm going to let that all sit together for about 30 minutes, and this is the result. And if we compare that to the previous batch, you can see there's a much better rise than the previous time. So then it was time to develop more gluten strength. So like the last time, I'm going to do a stretch and fold, and then rotate 90 degrees and repeat that 3 more times. I will note that in comparison to the last batch, this dough is a lot more elastic at this point, which is very promising for the final product. After the stretch and fold, I'm going to fold it over onto the underside of the dough and rotating it to make it into a ball shape. And then the lid goes back on top, and this goes back in the oven to proof for another 30 minutes. Now after 30 minutes, what you can see is the top of the lid has bowed upwards, meaning CO2 has been made by the yeast, showing good and healthy yeast activity. And this dough has continued to grow in size, and now starting again with a wet hand, I'm going to do the same series of stretch and folds to build up gluten strength. Finally make it into a top ball. Now I'm going to pop this back in my makeshift proofing oven and allow that to proof for an additional 1 hour. Now that it's been 1 hour, it's time to shape the loaf. So I'm heavily flouring my work surface and placing the dough on top of it. Then I'm going to pat it down into a large rectangle, adding any additional flour so it doesn't stick to the surface. Then to start to shape my loaf, I'm pulling from one corner to the center and following that all the way around. Next, I'm pulling 2 opposite corners away from each other and then folding them into the center and then rotating at 90 degrees and repeating that. Then I'm going to flip it over onto the seal side, and then using my pastry cutter, I'm pulling and rotating 90 degrees to the underside of the dough to make it taut. And since again I don't have a proofing basket, the trick I've learned is to place a towel inside a bowl, heavily flour the towel, and then place the dough inside with the seam side up. And then I'm going to proof this again for 90 minutes. After 60 minutes, I did remove it from the oven that still had the steam bath inside because I turned on the oven to 460 degrees and also added the Dutch oven this time to preheat everything. And I let that preheat for 30 minutes. Now that the bread has risen nicely, it's time to remove it from the bowl and place it on the seam side down onto a piece of parchment paper. I like to score this with a serrated knife, and I'm going to place that into the hot Dutch oven that was preheated with the oven. I need to spray down the top of it with some water and then place the lid on top for 20 minutes inside the oven to allow it to get that nice oven spring. After 20 minutes, this is what it looked like, so I removed the lid and baked it uncovered for an initial 25 minutes, to which time it reached this nice golden to brown color. But you want to just cook it uncovered until your desired color. Then I removed it from the Dutch oven and allowed it to cool on a wire rack for at least an hour before cutting inside of it. And this is what the final loaf looked like on the outside. Now it's time to cut in the inside and see how it turned out. And I'll say that the inside has a nice uniform air bubbles from the center to the crust, so I think this proofing method worked wonders with minimal extra effort, and I highly recommend it if your house temperature is too cold for normal proofing bread. Now, as for the flavor, it kind of reminds me of a rustic loaf that you get from the grocery store. So the crust is crunchy and the crumb is light, and the flavor is pretty one-dimensional, unfortunately. So based on the 2 loaves that I made, I think that the poolish adds a nice extra depth of flavor, and this proofing method works great. So what I'm going to try next is replacing some of the regular bread flour with some other flours to add another depth of flavor. So all said, thank you so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments if any of this was helpful. If you want to see more where this journey goes, please consider subscribing so you don't miss out on the next video in this series, and I will see you again soon.